One night, a woman is being brutally attacked in her own home. She tries to fight back, but the attacker pulls out a gun and fires. Not long after, the police arrive at the scene. The victim, a woman named Helen, is found dead. Her husband, Dr. Richard, is immediately taken to the police station for questioning. And from here, everything changes. This is the fugitive.
Your fugitive's name is...
At the station, Richard explains what happened, at least from his side of the story. A few hours earlier, he and Helen had attended a charity fundraiser at a fancy hotel. After the event, they went home together. On the way back, Richard suddenly received an emergency call from the hospital, even though he was supposed to be off duty that night. He was disappointed because he had wanted to spend the rest of the evening with his wife. Still, he turned around and went in to work. According to Richard, when he finally returned home, he found Helen unconscious on the floor, and the attacker was trying to escape. In the struggle that followed, Richard noticed something very specific about the man who killed his wife. The attacker was disabled, with a prosthetic arm on one side. This is the point where the police start doubting his story. To them, it sounds impossible. How could a man with one prosthetic arm overpower a healthy woman, then get away from the scene without a single injury or any trace left behind? Things get even stranger when the police find no signs of forced entry at Richard's house. No broken windows, no damaged locks. Whoever came in, if anyone did, either had a key or was let inside. Then there is the question of motive. Nothing valuable is missing, so it does not look like a robbery. On top of that, they discover that a few months earlier, Helen had taken out a large life insurance policy with a very high payout. That detail makes the police look even harder at Richard. In the end, they cannot find any solid evidence that points to anyone else. Step by step, the investigation narrows until Richard becomes the only believable suspect in their eyes. When the case goes to trial, the prosecutor presents one more crucial piece of evidence. It is enough to convince the judge and the jury that Richard is guilty. Before she died, Helen managed to call 911. During that call, she said a few words that could be interpreted in more than one way. The message is actually ambiguous, but because everyone already suspects Richard, those words are taken as proof against him.
To play Helen Kimball's 911 emergency call.
Please help me. You're still in the house.
Did I hear you right?
He's trying to kill me.
Ma'am?
Believed to have carried out a premeditated murder, Richard is sentenced to death. Of course, carrying out a death sentence takes time. While waiting for his execution, Richard is sent to a special prison, together with several other inmates. On the way there, while the prison bus is driving through a forested area, one of the prisoners suddenly pretends to have a heart attack. Hidden inside his sock, he has a sharp weapon ready. In a panic, the guard moves in to help him. The prisoner uses that moment to attack, and a violent struggle breaks out. Because of the chaos, the driver loses control of the bus. The vehicle crashes and plunges into a ravine. Even after such a brutal accident, a few people survive, including Richard. One of the guards, who knows Richard and trusts him as a doctor, quickly unlocks his handcuffs because right now his medical skills are desperately needed. But before anyone can truly get to safety, they hear the sound of a train. The wrecked bus has landed right on the tracks. Everyone scrambles to save themselves, running and crawling away from the impending collision. Everyone except Richard. In that critical moment, instead of thinking only of himself, he stays behind to help the injured guard who just freed him. The impact sends the train off the tracks and triggers a massive wreck. Despite the chaos, Richard survives. Not long after, the escaped inmate from earlier shows up again and offers to help him. He does not want money or protection, only silence in return. Before long, the entire crash site fills with emergency crews, firefighters, and local police. A U.S. Marshal named Detective Samuel Gerald arrives to take control of the scene. The guard who caused the escape is already surrounded by officers and proudly claims he saved a prisoner. Based on his statement, the local authorities initially declare all inmates dead. Gerald does not buy a single word of it. He immediately senses something is off and realizes one of the prisoners is still alive and on the run. A full-scale search begins. Meanwhile, Richard has been moving through the forest all night and finally reaches a residential area. Exhausted, injured, and still in prison clothing, he needs a disguise. His stomach wound is getting worse, so he heads toward the safest place to treat himself and hide at the same time, a hospital. Gerald suspects Richard is hurt and sends officers to patrol nearby medical facilities. Richard anticipates this. He shaves, takes clothes from an unconscious patient, and changes his entire appearance. As he heads out, he accidentally walks past one of the officers assigned to look for him, but thanks to the disguise, he goes unnoticed. Outside, an ambulance sits with the engine still running. Richard climbs in and drives off before anyone realizes what is happening. At the same time, Gerald and his team expand their search. They tap every phone belonging to people close to Richard, believing he might reach out for help. A report soon comes in. A nearby hospital is missing an ambulance. Gerald does not hesitate and orders an immediate pursuit. It does not take long before they spot the stolen vehicle. Police block off roads and position cars ahead of him. Richard sees a tunnel up ahead. This could be either a trap or his last chance. Both ends of the tunnel are sealed off by police units. With nowhere left to go, panic sets in until Richard suddenly finds a desperate idea. A short time later, officers search the abandoned ambulance. The doors are open, the driver's seat is empty, and Richard has vanished. Gerald studies the scene carefully. Most officers assume Richard escaped on foot into the open. Gerald notices something they missed, a storm drain, and for the first time, he knows exactly where Richard went. During the escape, Richard tries throwing his coat in the opposite direction to confuse the police. It is a simple trick, and Detective Gerald does not fall for it. He has already split his team into two groups, predicting Richard's moves before they happen. The storm drain Richard is traveling through twists and turns, and the path is rough and slippery. While chasing him, Gerald loses his footing and falls, dropping his gun. That is where the two finally come face to face. Richard points a gun at him, exhausted and cornered. But instead of using it, he makes a desperate choice to run. He has a perfect chance to shoot but refuses to take it. Gerald pulls out a backup weapon and the chase continues. Richard runs until he reaches a dead end. He still refuses to fire because deep down, he is not a killer. With nowhere left to go, Richard jumps from a massive dam. The height is so extreme that every officer watching assumes he is dead. If anyone else had been leading the case, the search would have ended right there. Against all odds, Richard survives. The cold water, the impact, and the long swim weaken him badly. By the time he reaches land, he is shaking uncontrollably. He hides in a pile of leaves just to stay warm. As he drifts into sleep, memories flash through his mind. Memories of chasing the real killer. In that moment, the doubt fades and the truth feels clearer than ever. Richard is innocent. Once he regains some strength, he continues moving. Inside his pocket is a wallet with enough money for a temporary place to stay. To avoid being recognized, he changes his appearance and dyes his hair. Instead of fleeing to some remote place, Richard heads back to the city, determined to prove the truth. Meanwhile, Gerald refuses to slow down. To him, this case now involves two fugitives, not one. With help from intelligence teams, they track down the other escaped inmate. The next morning, Gerald and his team prepare a tactical strike. During the operation, one of Gerald's officers is taken hostage. In most cases, a negotiation would follow. Gerald does the opposite. Without hesitation, he fires and takes control of the situation. It breaks protocol, and his team is frustrated. But it also reveals who he is, someone who will stop at nothing to end a chase, which means Richard's situation is getting even more dangerous. Back in the city, Richard reaches out to his former lawyer, hoping for a little money or support. The lawyer refuses out of fear, and even that short conversation is enough to alert the police, who have been listening in. With no other choice, Richard turns to someone he hopes he can still trust, an old friend and fellow doctor named Charles. Their meeting is brief. Richard only asks for enough cash to keep going, and he leaves quickly, not wanting to drag his friend into the chaos surrounding him. During the ongoing manhunt, Detective Gerald becomes more curious about Richard himself. The case bothers him. The supposed motive never made sense. Richard was a successful doctor with money and stability, not someone who would suddenly murder his wife for insurance. The more Gerald looks at the facts, the stranger the case feels. Meanwhile, Richard is surviving on whatever he can manage. He rents a small basement room from a local resident because it is the cheapest option he can find. At least now he has a roof over his head instead of sleeping outdoors. With his disguise and limited resources, Richard returns to his hometown, determined to uncover the truth and find the person who actually killed Helen. One afternoon, he goes to a hospital that specializes in prosthetics and treatment for disabled patients. There is even a facility inside that manufactures artificial limbs. Richard's goal there is simple: steal an employee ID card from the janitorial staff so he can gain access later. At the same time, Gerald continues connecting the dots. He questions Charles, Richard's old friend. Instead of denying anything, Charles calmly admits that Richard did visit him the day before. Before the conversation ends, he warns the officers that they will never catch Richard because he is far more capable than they realize. While Richard prepares the next steps of his plan, Gerald dives deeper into the original case. The more he looks, the more inconsistencies he finds. Every family member, friend, and colleague insists Richard is innocent. That only fuels Gerald's determination to look closer. The next morning, police show up at the house where Richard is staying. Hearing voices outside, he freezes, convinced they found him. Fortunately, the officers are there for a completely unrelated arrest. They are after the homeowner's son for suspected drug dealing. Richard stays hidden and avoids being caught. Once night falls, Richard puts his plan into motion. Wearing a janitor uniform and using the stolen ID, he slips back into the hospital without raising suspicion. His mission is to find records of men in the city with prosthetic arms. There are hundreds of names, but by comparing details and physical descriptions, he narrows the list down significantly. At that same moment, his cover finally collapses. The tenant who was arrested earlier must have recognized his face from a police poster and reported him. Gerald wastes no time and heads straight to the house. Richard is still inside the hospital when a sudden influx of patients creates chaos. The staff is overwhelmed and a doctor urgently asks him for help moving a young patient. Richard instantly recognizes the signs of an emergency. Without hesitation, he alters the medical notes so the child can be taken to surgery immediately. But that small decision has consequences. The same doctor who asked for his help notices the sudden change in paperwork and becomes suspicious. The timing does not make sense. Her concern turns into certainty, and just like that, Richard's disguise is exposed. Not long after the chaos at the hospital, Gerald arrives, but Richard is already gone. At this point, Gerald is no longer just chasing a fugitive. He is trying to understand what Richard is after. If Richard only wanted freedom, he could have disappeared into the countryside or fled the country. Instead, he keeps returning to places connected to the case. Then the answer becomes clearer. Gerald discovers the hospital wing dedicated to prosthetic patients. That is when everything starts to make sense. Richard is not running, he is investigating. Based on the hospital files, there are only 5 men in the city who match the physical description of the killer. Richard begins reaching out to each one. One is already dead. Another is sitting in jail after a failed bank robbery. That second man becomes Richard's next target, so he heads straight to the facility where the suspect is being held. The problem is that the entire place is filled with police. Richard manages to slip inside after several checks. He eventually reaches the suspect, only to realize immediately that he has the wrong man. Without hesitation, he turns around and tries to leave before anyone notices. His sudden movement catches the attention of a guard. Then while heading down a staircase, Richard walks right into Detective Gerald. Richard sprints away. When he reaches the lobby, he uses a desperate tactic to stall the officers chasing him. For a moment, it works. But once the confusion clears, every officer in the building joins the pursuit. Luck steps in again. Outside, a massive parade is blocking roads. Thousands of people flood the streets, and Richard disappears into the crowd before the police can catch up. The news spreads fast. A convicted murderer has escaped yet again and slipped past authorities in broad daylight. After resting and changing clothes, Richard returns to his search the next morning. One name from his list never answered the phone. That silence is suspicious. He goes to the address connected to it, and sure enough, a police officer is already stationed there. Gerald must have predicted the same move. Richard does not give up. He sneaks around the building and forces his way inside through the back. What he finds confirms everything he has suspected. Inside a drawer are photos of the man Richard believes killed Helen, along with a prosthetic arm identical to the one he saw during the struggle at his home. But then comes a shock. Among the photos, Richard finds something far worse. There are pictures showing the killer with someone Richard knows well, a close friend, a trusted colleague, a brilliant surgeon named Dr. Alex. And on the night Helen died, Richard was only called to the hospital because Alex claimed he had urgent business. Back at the office, Detective Gerald suddenly receives a phone call. At first, everyone assumes it is just another prank from someone pretending to be Richard. But this time, it really is him. Richard calmly explains that he has solved the case of his wife's murder. Right away, the police begin tracing the call. Richard keeps the line open on purpose. He wants Gerald to come to the scene and see the evidence with his own eyes. When Gerald arrives, he examines everything carefully. There are photos, the phone Richard used, and traces that clearly connect the house to the investigation. But then, the owner of the house walks in. His name is Sykes, and he is the same man Richard believes killed Helen. Despite being surrounded by law enforcement, Sykes acts calm and confident. His tone, his behavior, everything he says is designed to make him look innocent. This is not the first time his name has been linked to the murder. A year earlier, police questioned him, but he had a solid alibi and walked away untouched. Gerald listens closely. The way Sykes talks does not match the facts. Something feels wrong. Instead of letting him go freely, Gerald assigns a surveillance team to watch his every move for the next 48 hours. Meanwhile, Richard reaches out to Charles again and reveals everything he has learned. According to Richard, Dr. Alex was behind the setup. Alex had developed a new drug, and Richard discovered dangerous side effects that could destroy the project. To protect the drug and the profits behind it, Richard believes Alex framed him for murder. Charles dismisses the accusation and argues that none of it makes sense, especially because Alex is already dead. Not long after that conversation, Gerald intercepts Charles. Somehow he already knows they spoke. Gerald questions him about Sykes and Alex, but Charles denies knowing either of them. His answer only makes things more suspicious. The real reason Richard contacted Charles earlier was not just to talk. He needed access to the hospital lab where his old research was stored. He retrieves an old sample and takes it to a trusted colleague for analysis. The results confirm his fears. The sample was tampered with, altered by someone so the drug could pass approval testing. For a moment, Richard is convinced Alex was responsible since the formula was his creation. But the doctor examining the sample points out something shocking. The altered test was processed after Alex had already died. Someone else made the change, and that someone was the hospital director, Richard's longtime friend, Charles. Detective Gerald continues digging, and his team finally pieces together more of the truth. They discover that Alex, the man connected to the stolen research and Richard's accusations, is already dead. Even more surprising, Alex and Charles were close. If that is true, then why did Charles lie during questioning? The deeper they look, the more inconsistencies appear. Documents regarding Alex's death raise red flags. Then comes the biggest breakthrough. One of Gerald's officers manages to pull Richard's old phone records. On the night Helen was murdered, someone used Richard's car phone to contact Sykes, even though Richard never met him. That means someone framed him by using his own phone to reach the killer. While Gerald is closing in on the truth, danger is catching up to Richard. Sykes has been tracking him and waits for the right moment to finish the job. That moment comes on a late-night train. A passenger recognizes Richard's face from a newspaper and alerts a nearby officer. Just as Richard prepares to run, Sykes appears out of nowhere with a gun. A shootout breaks out, and the officer intervenes just in time.
Kimball!
If that officer had not shown up, Richard would likely be dead. Richard manages to overpower Sykes and restrain him, but he does not kill him. There is a reason. Sykes may have committed the crime, but he was never the mastermind. Unfortunately, before passing out, the officer manages to radio in Richard's location. Now the entire city believes Richard killed a cop during his escape. The manhunt becomes even more intense. That night, Richard goes to a luxury hotel where Charles is scheduled to speak at a medical conference. As soon as he enters, police surround the building and prepare to take him down. Gerald rushes in, hoping to stop a fatal mistake. Inside, Richard finally confronts Charles. It turns out Charles holds the patent for the drug Alex created. Exposing the drug's side effects would have destroyed the company and cost millions. To protect his payday, Charles orchestrated Helen's murder and ensured Richard took the blame. When confronted, Charles acts calm, confident, and dismissive. He invites Richard to talk privately in a hotel room, but once inside, he suddenly attacks. A violent fight breaks out. Richard eventually gains the upper hand, forcing Charles into retreat. Before the confrontation can end, a police helicopter arrives outside the window. Because Richard is officially a fugitive, officers are ready to shoot.
Call off the helicopter.
Gerald reaches the scene just in time and orders them to stand down. Once the situation stabilizes, Richard goes after Charles again. The fight continues and both men fall from a height, crashing through equipment below. Charles manages to get back on his feet and escapes before the police arrive. Richard is still dazed from the fall, badly injured and struggling to move. The lower floor is cluttered with machinery, making visibility difficult and giving Charles plenty of places to hide. A moment later, Detective Gerald reaches him and urges Richard to step out of hiding. The truth is finally exposed. Gerald explains that on the night of Helen's murder, while Richard was covering for Alex at the hospital, Charles secretly duplicated the keys to his house and car. That is how Sykes entered the home without leaving signs of forced entry. As Gerald reveals everything, Charles listens from the shadows. Realizing there is no escape now, panic finally sets in. With the evidence against him exposed, his only remaining option is to silence Gerald. Before Charles can act, Richard intervenes. Using whatever strength he has left, he strikes Charles and stops him for good. Outside, the hotel is surrounded by reporters and flashing cameras. To the public, Richard is still a convicted murderer, and a dangerous fugitive. The only way to clear his name is through the justice system. So even though Gerald now knows Richard is innocent, he still handcuffs him while they walk through the crowd. The moment they are out of sight, the cuffs come off. All the evidence is finally in their hands. Now it is only a matter of time before Richard's name is cleared and the truth becomes public. So the moral of the story is, if you're going to frame someone, at least hide the prosthetic arm and maybe don't involve a parade.